Now, the latest from ITV News Meridian in the south.
Good evening, welcome to ITV News Meridian.
Tonight's headlines here in the south. We're struggling to meet expectations. The stark admission from South Central Ambulance Service following another catastrophic delay where one man died.
Guilty, the brothers who threw acid in a mother's face, leaving her blind in one eye and scarred for life.
We're with the part-time soldiers giving up their day jobs to hone their combat skills.
And I'm spending a lovely sunny day in a gorgeous garden, but not just any garden, because this one has therapeutic benefits for those who use it. Oh, and I've got some gardening weather for you too.
Good evening to you. We're being pushed to our limit and we are struggling. That's the extraordinary admission from South Central Ambulance Service tonight following a series of catastrophic delays.
In an exclusive interview, the Director of Operations has told ITV Meridian they're struggling to deliver what patients expect. It comes after a coroner said an ambulance delay may have contributed to the death of a pensioner. Peter James waited more than 2 hours for paramedics to arrive after a fall. He died shortly afterwards. The ambulance service said it was responding to more urgent calls at the time.
Well, just last week we told you how the family of a 6-year-old boy from Portsmouth with a badly broken leg was forced to make its own way to hospital after the ambulance failed to arrive. Mel Blaw's been investigating what's happened to the emergency service.
This is one of Jennifer James's favourite photos of her husband, taken at their daughter's wedding 6 years ago.
He was an amazing man. He was really, really inspirational. Everybody that knew him said he was very special.
At the time of his death, 72-year-old Peter James had been battling a rare and incurable disease known as amyloidosis. He'd already undergone liver, kidney and bone marrow transplants, but his body had rejected the donor kidney, which led to him being hospitalised and put on dialysis shortly before his fall.
He looked to me as if he'd broken his leg. It later transpired it was his hip, but I couldn't move him. So at 6:35 I rang for the ambulance, answered a load of questions, tried to be as calm as I could, and said I couldn't move him, said he was in pain, said he'd been in hospital and had come out, and assumed that an ambulance would come.
But unbeknown to Mrs. James, Peter's fall had been classed as low priority. More than an hour passed and still no ambulance, so she called again at 7:45, asking for one to come. The couple's daughter then phoned at 8:44 when her father stopped breathing. The fall was finally classed as life-threatening. An ambulance arrived 6 minutes later and Peter was taken to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, where he died later that morning.
The doctor let us stay with him and we felt that we were able to say goodbye, but it was a dreadful experience, and I think people ought to know that if you ring for an ambulance, it isn't going to come straight away.
Nationally, the ambulance services are pushed to the limits. We have very stretching targets to get to our life-threatening calls, and they obviously take the priorities. So the lower grade calls, which could be patients falling on the floor, are often left for some considerable time waiting for an ambulance response. So nationally, they are stretched. We see an annual increase of 5 to 10% in our demand on 909 calls, and that is going up year on year. So we are really struggling to deliver the patients' expectations.
Had the ambulance arrived sooner, do you feel your husband would still be alive today?
I think that's impossible to say, but I think he wouldn't have been in pain for 2 hours.
This Friday is Jennifer's birthday, the first in 50 years she'll spend without her husband. Mel Blaw, ITV News, Wokingham.
So sad. Well, our reporter Mel Blore joins us from the newsroom now. Mel, the ambulance service says it's struggling, but what can they do about it?
Well, I've been trying to get to the bottom of this. I spoke to the Department of Health, who referred us to NHS England. I called them and asked them who's going to take responsibility for the pressures currently facing South Central Ambulance Service. And they told us they weren't willing to talk about this particular case involving Mr James's death. However, they acknowledged that the NHS as a whole has seen an unprecedented demand on its services this year due to an increasing and ageing population.
So Mel, what does Mrs James hope to achieve from her campaign?
Well, she wants the questions asked by the operator during the 999 call to be looked at. She felt that they didn't probe enough when it came to finding out about her husband's past medical history, and she feels if they had, they would have given the call a much higher priority. Of course, nothing will bring back her husband, but she wants to make sure no one else endures a similar ordeal.
Mel Blore, thank you for that.
In other news, a man's been found guilty of throwing acid into the face of a woman and scarring her for life in a row over drugs.
Carla Whitlock was blinded in one eye after 22-year-old Billy Midmore and his brother Jeffrey attacked her outside the Turtle Bay restaurant in Southampton back in September. They were later caught on CCTV celebrating, as Andrew Pate explains.
This is Billy Midmore high-fiving his brother shortly after they'd thrown acid into the face of Carla Whitlock. The mother of 6 was the victim of a revenge attack over a drug deal that had gone wrong. She was blinded in one eye and scarred for life.
It's changed my life completely, everything.
Billy and his brother Jeffrey went to buy drain cleaner in Southampton the morning of the attack. Billy seen here with the cleaner, which contains sulfuric acid. The injuries sustained by Carla as a result of the attack are horrific and will stay with her for the rest of her life. Carla will now have to rebuild her life, and provisions are in place from the wider health and social support networks to help her do that. Billy Midmore admitted being part of the group heading towards Turtle Bay restaurant. He told the court he'd gone to a nearby park to sell drugs by the time the attack happened. But despite the CCTV not being clear, the jury decided he was by his brother's side when the acid was thrown. It was only thanks to the swift actions of a bouncer from the restaurant that Carla didn't lose sight in both eyes.
She came running over screaming, so the first thing we done was sat her down, went to her first aid, obviously called the police and the ambulance straight away. The next thing, when we turned round again, her face had started to melt, and also Alan, my colleague, his arm had started to burn and melt as well. It was, like I say, it was a very scary experience.
7 months on from the attack, Carla Whitlock faces further skin grafts and an operation on her eye. When the foreman said guilty, Billy Midmore started shaking his head and muttering. He slumped into his chair and started banging its arms with his hands. He then swore and was sent out. The judge will sentence Billy and Jeffrey Midmore at a later date. He called the attack frightening and appalling and told the jury it highlights the problems involved with the drug trade. Andrew Pate, ITV News, Southampton.
A hearse has been driven through Westminster today to highlight the struggle of those affected by the contaminated blood scandal.
More than 2,000 people have died after being infected with HIV, hepatitis C and other viruses during blood transfusions in the 1970s and 80s.
Well, today those from the south still living with the conditions campaigned against plans to reduce financial support to survivors, as Sam Holder reports.
They are the survivors and the widows.
I was infected with HIV in 1983 and then hepatitis C in 89 through contaminated blood.
My wife died through the administration of contaminated blood products. She contracted hepatitis C.
Campaigning outside Parliament against plans to change compensation for victims. The thousands infected by NHS blood transfusions in the 70s and 80s. Mostly haemophiliacs, the blood was taken from American prisoners and homeless. Many had contagious diseases that were then passed on, shown by the campaign's colours: red for HIV, yellow for hepatitis C, the black for the 2,000 victims who've died in the past 35 years. A parliamentary debate is now underway discussing the future of yearly payments to victims. Campaigners say changes could leave many receiving less money, and bereaved partners and families could lose out.
They refuse to accept the fact that dependents must now be looked after financially, because if the main breadwinner is gone.
Trying to get the government to eventually do something. It's been going on so many years. Yes, they've apologised, but, you know, it's just ridiculous.
The Department of Health say they want to help those affected by the tragedy, and they've committed an extra £100 million of funding to the new scheme on top of the current £22 million a year. But for those affected, it's about knowing they and their families will be financially secure in the future.
We need to be able to live our lives to do that. A sorry from Mr Cameron doesn't cut it. He needs to back it up with the finances.
Sam Holder, ITV News.
Dorset County Hospital in Dorchester could integrate its maternity and children's services with Yeovil instead of Poole or Bournemouth. After months of protest, this latest recommendation has been welcomed by campaigners.
You're watching ITV News here in the Meridian region. Thanks for choosing us. Coming up.
150 years after it was founded, we trace the mixed fortunes of the organisation that's given millions of deserving youngsters a chance at life.
Follow us online at itv.com/Meridian. Give us a call. You can also message us on Facebook or send us a tweet at ITV Meridian.
A military court has been hearing evidence of a drinking session involving 2 soldiers and the female corporal they're accused of raping.
Corporal Anne-Marie Element died 2 years after making allegations against the men. Martin Dowse reports from the Courtmartial Centre at Bulford.
On the second day of this court-martial, we heard from witnesses who were with Corporal Anne-Marie Element and the 2 colleagues accused of raping her on the night in question. They were all having an after-work drinking session in the corporal's mess at Sennelager Barracks in Germany. Anne-Marie had had a disagreement with a female colleague earlier in the day. She was upset and telling corporals Tom Fulton here on the right and Jeremy Jones on the left all about it. Corporal Aaron Harris was also in the mess that night. He told the court-martial that as more and more alcohol was consumed, he saw Anne-Marie kissing and touching Tom Fulton and sitting on Jeremy Jones's lap at the bar. He said all 3 were flirting and seemed to be enjoying it. Corporal Joseph Merron was another witness in the mess. He said that Jeremy Jones poured Anne-Marie a cocktail with about 7 shots of spirits in it. He said that when all 3 left the bar, they were very drunk. The prosecution says that after leaving the mess, Anne-Marie ended up back at Jeremy Jones's barrack room where she was raped by both him and Thomas Fulton. Members of Anne-Marie's family were once again at the hearing today to listen to the evidence. Yesterday, they'd heard Anne-Marie herself in a Royal Military Police interview video describe how she remembered saying no to Tom Fulton and trying to push him off her as he had sex with her. The court-martial continues. Martin Dowse, ITV News, Bulford Camp.
A teenager is in a serious condition in hospital after she was attacked with a hammer in Portsmouth. The 17-year-old was assaulted at a house on Shearer Road last night.
A third man's been arrested on suspicion of murder after a man was hit by a lorry during a fight. Georgie Yazchuk, who was 23, died on Western Road in Brighton in the early hours of Sunday morning. 2 other men in their 20s have been released on bail.
Now it's 14 minutes past 6. Let's cross to London now for a quick preview of what's making the national and world headlines. Here's Mark Austin.
Leaving the EU could cause severe regional and global damage. That's the warning from the International Monetary Fund. Leave campaigners claim the IMF has been consistently wrong in the past. A crackdown on cosmetic cowboys, no more 2-for-1 offers in new guidance to protect vulnerable patients. The music producer and reality TV star David Guest is found dead. He was 62. Join Charlene White and me at 6:30.
Now, the role of reservists in our armed forces has never been as great, with the latest figures showing they make up more than a quarter of the Army's strength.
The extra duties they now take on have been illustrated in Dorset with a series of exercises on the ranges at Lulworth. Here's Duncan Slytone.
The Challenger 2 is Britain's main battle tank. Watching it fire live ammunition, you can see why it's regarded as one of the best in the world. The crew on board today are highly skilled and have spent years training, but they're all reservists, soldiers who do this in their spare time. As the modernisation of the Army continues, the value of the reserves is more important than ever. And so this is a very important opportunity for these part-time soldiers to practice on these tanks. This exercise, firing live ammunition, only happens once a year. The Royal Wessex Yeomanry is the only reserve regiment to crew these tanks. It has squadrons in Wiltshire and Dorset. Edmund Wiggins is based in Salisbury.
It is vital that we get enough time on tanks in order to stay qualified. Essentially, we have simulators as well. However, the real thing from simulators is not massively different, but you know, it's definitely something you need to be able to do.
The government's cutting numbers of full-time soldiers from 102,000 to 82,000. Meanwhile, it's doubling the reserve force to 30,000. Ministers are aiming to make £9 billion worth of savings in defence spending by 2020. In the Army's eyes, what's the difference between these crews and the regular crews?
With the modern reserve, there is theoretically no difference. So, for example, a commander of Challenger 2 would still have to do the regular course, which is a significant commitment of time. The drivers, the gunners, the loaders have to complete the same tests, the same training, the same preparation, and therefore they're able to slot into the regular regiments as required.
This is an expensive but important exercise, vital for the crews and vital for Britain as it increasingly relies on its reserve soldiers. Duncan Slytone, ITV News on the Lulworth Ranges.
Let's now move on to football's big battles, and Brighton have kept up the pressure on the Championship's top two. After victory last night at Nottingham Forest, they've closed the gap between themselves and second-place Middlesbrough to just 1 point, and they're only 2 points off the leaders, Burnley. Well, last night's win, somewhat fortunate I think, came thanks to Steve Sidwell's stoppage time strike, and Brighton now turn their attentions to Friday night when they host Fulham at the Amex. Such an important goal that, and Reading can do Brighton a big favour tonight. If they can beat Middlesbrough at the Riverside Stadium, it is a bit of a big ask, but Brian McDermott's team could welcome back Gareth McCleary. He's been out injured for 3 weeks.
And former Southampton player Adam Lallana has lent his support to the online auction set up by Bournemouth midfielder Harry Arter in memory of his stillborn daughter Renee. The Liverpool player has donated one of his England shirts. It's raising money for a charity which provides support for bereaved parents.
Now, back in 1866, one man founded a charity aimed at allowing children to break free from poverty. 150 years on, and Thomas Barnardos' name is still famous, and his dream, of course, still very much alive.
But the journey has not always been smooth, but the charity remains dedicated to helping the most vulnerable people, as Derek Johnson now explains.
Well, what's 4 times 4?
Meadows is one of 2 schools run by children's charity Barnardos, designed for pupils with social and emotional issues.
How many minutes ago is he?
Classes are small, helping them deal with those problems.
We've had students that have gone to university. We've also had students that have started their own businesses, provided them with the opportunity to have faith that they can access the adult world and be productive within that world.
It's better than being at a mainstream school because I found it quite hard because they didn't give you the help you needed.
Everyone's mostly got the same issues, so like they kind of combine together and just get along.
Thomas Barnardo was an Irish medical missionary who, 150 years ago, became appalled at the suffering of street children. Determined to give them a refuge, he opened homes and schools for boys. Many destitute girls were helped, but the enduring image is of the Barnardos boy. John Spencer was briefly one of them, when the stress of running a large family became too much for his sick mother.
What it built into me was a resilience in life, and my three things I always say that have got me through life were, first of all, being in Barnardos and the Barnardos boy, then joining the Scouts and going camping and great outdoor life, and then having to do national service. And I think that's what's made me a man.
Barnardos' mission to help has not been free of controversy. In the early 20th century, it was one of the charities involved in a government scheme to ship thousands of children overseas. Critics say they were little more than a source of cheap labour.
It is difficult, and obviously if you put it into the context of the 21st century, it's not something that any of us would do today. At the time, there was very few outlets for children in terms of providing them with a place of employment. The British Empire was a much closer thing, and the government saw Canada especially as an opportunity to provide boys specifically with an outlet of employment.
The last Barnardos homes closed in the 1980s. Today the charity mainly runs services such as counselling and adoption, and campaigns worldwide against child poverty and exploitation.
The greatest challenge that we face now in 2016 is that the demand for our services from the most vulnerable children, young people and their families is outstripping our ability to meet those needs. We now support 250,000 children, young people and their families every single year. We support the most vulnerable in society.
Barnardos says we believe in children. And I think if you can actually take those young children and say, right, we believe in you, what we want is for you to start believing in yourself. You're not the victim of circumstances, and they can do it. It's about that belief.
Work that began in Victorian squalor continues thanks to one man. Even today, everybody knows his name. Derek Johnson, ITV News.
Incredible work they do. Now, this week is National Garden Week. It's a chance to go behind closed gates and discover some of the hidden gems right across our region.
Well, Simon's been to the Thrive Garden in Reading, where they use gardening as a form of therapy.
How many kinds of sweet flowers grow in an English country garden?
Well, there's no denying this is a gorgeous garden to wander through, but Jan, there's an awful lot more to it than that.
Yeah, here at Thrive we're looking to make positive changes to the lives of people with disabilities.
So how do you use gardening as a therapy?
It has a range of benefits, some physical, so perhaps people who've had a stroke and have got a partial paralysis, they come into the gardens, they're moving in ways that's going to increase their reach. And then we've got psychological benefits. We also have social benefits. So many of the guys here enjoy coming to meet other people, new people, their friends.
So how many people actually use this garden?
We're about 100 a week here, just under that.
How many insects come here and go through our English country garden?
So let's meet two of the people who regularly garden here at Thrive, Camilla and Dean. Camilla, this is your area, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
What are you growing?
I'm growing tulips and I'm also growing herbs.
And why is it you like coming here?
Because I like spending time with my friends. I like working to do my plot and I like just being outside.
Well, being outside on a day like today is lovely, isn't it, Dean? But what's your favourite thing?
Weeding.
Weeding. That's the thing that everybody hates doing in their garden. So we're all going to want you to come round to our houses to finish our work for us that we can't bear doing.
Yeah, there is joy in the spring when the birds begin to sing in an English country garden.
Of course, to get a garden looking this good, you don't just need people with green fingers. You also could do with the proper growing conditions. So, is the weather going to play ball? Here's the forecast.
From blizzards to pool, driving through Europe. Eurotunnel the Shuttle sponsors ITV Meridian weather.
Well, there have been a few meaty showers knocking around today, and the plan for the next few days is for some unsettled weather to come our way. Remember back last month when things were very calm and quiet? That's when the jet stream was to the north of us. Well, over the last few days it slipped a bit further south, and that means for the next week or so we are going to expect low pressure systems, and that means, yes, more rain or showers at times. So as I say, few showers around today, but they're fizzling out this evening, and then we're dry with a lot of clear spells. Now during the night it will get quite nippy. Temperatures down to around 3 degrees, but only a little bit of ruralised frost, and there will be some mist forming towards the coast as well. That'll burn away pretty quickly tomorrow morning, and it should be a pretty decent Wednesday. Some fine, dry, bright and sunny weather on the go, but again we're going to see a few isolated showers cropping up into the afternoon. Fairly few and far between, and they should be mostly light if one lands on you, but for most of us we're going to stay dry, and with light winds it should feel pleasantly warm with temperatures up to around 14, maybe 15 degrees. As for your high tide times in Brighton, 4 o'clock in the morning, then 4:30 tomorrow afternoon.
Eurotunnel the Shuttle sponsors ITV Meridian weather.
Not a bad forecast. And in just a moment, it's the ITV Evening News with Mark Austin and Charlene White.
Stacey's got outlet news. Join her if you can. But for now, from the team here at ITV Meridian, thanks very much for watching. Take care from us all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.